News Munchies with Ted Corliss. Today's topic is not about cannabis. Can you believe that? Why would that be? Well, let me suggest this to you. For the past 10 years, cannabis has been rockin' and rollin'. Yes, 1996 was the very first time a state, California, legalized cannabis for medicinal purposes. But let's be honest, the last 10 years, it's been the decade of cannabis. You now see it in literally 30 plus states. You can buy it with a prescription, and in some states you can buy it without. But I'm not here to talk to you about cannabis. I'm here to talk to you about one of cannabis's close friends called psilocybin mushrooms. Why? Why are we talking about psilocybin mushrooms? Why did 60 Minutes just recently do an entire section on the issue of whether or not magic mushrooms that you find growing on cow dung in Midwestern farms can be used to treat migraines, epilepsy, depression, and provide enormous comfort to people who are in end-stage cancer? Is this appropriate? What do we think about it? Well, let me suggest to you that I declare that the next decade of America is the decade of the mushroom. That's because last year, Denver decriminalized cannabis. Oh, I'm sorry, not cannabis. They decriminalized psilocybin mushrooms. I'm just going to say magic mushrooms to make things a little bit easier going on. But when we talk about magic mushrooms and when they decriminalized it, they specifically decriminalized psilocybin cubensis mushrooms. Now, there's some other varieties that are very similar to it, but it's the same idea. If somebody's growing mushrooms, you know what you call them? You don't call them a mushroom farmer. They're tryptamine farmers. They're growing tryptamines. Psilocybin and psilocybin affect the brain chemistry of the individual by stabilizing it. If you use regular microdoses or you routinely, I think I've seen monthly, using them either in a lower dose or go all the way, go epic. You want to meet God? Sure, I did once. Boy, was she mad. Well, here's the thing. Mushrooms are coming. They've been all over Europe for a long time. You used to be able to buy them in Amsterdam, but even Amsterdam, you can buy heroin in Amsterdam, but you can't buy magic mushrooms anymore. That makes a lot of sense. But by the way, when you're out in Amsterdam, don't confuse the coke with the heroin, because when I was out there, they had signs everywhere. I'm looking for magic mushrooms. Nope, didn't find them, but I found a bunch of guys selling me white heroin. Lovely. Well, not a big opioid fan, as you can tell. But I am a big fan of magic mushrooms. First time I ever consumed them, I was a teenager with a friend of mine who I believe got them from a farm where they will find them in manure. And why is that? It's because cows and horses will eat the mushrooms, and then when they poop them out, the spores grow in the dung. That doesn't sound very appetizing. So there's a lot of other ways now that you can find them. And if you look online, there are some fantastic places where you can actually buy your own spores. You can buy your own spores, and they'll tell you that these spores cannot be used to produce magic mushrooms. They believe you're purchasing them because you're going to study the spores under a microscope. The psilocybin cubensis spores do not contain any active alkaloids. That doesn't come until you put them through a two-step process. First, growing them in mycelia jars, and then having them fruit in a chamber. Now, whether you want to get into all of that or not, it's not difficult. There's a little bit of a learning curve, but here's the value to you. And that is, if you, be careful, because growing magic mushrooms is still illegal under federal law. It's still a Schedule 1 narcotic, which is essentially a statement that they're too dangerous and too addictive, which is hilarious because they're neither. In fact, the medical data reflects that psilocybin cubensis mushrooms are safer than aspirin. More people have died from aspirin than psilocybin cubensis. In fact, the LD50, which is the percentage of 50% of people exposed to a particular dosage would die. The LD50 for psilocybin mushrooms is about 150 pounds of mushrooms in a day. So you better get eaten if you want to overdose, and no one's ever been able to pull it off. Not suggesting that you get crazy with the psychedelic version of this. If those are your boundaries, that's fine. But what I'm suggesting to you other folks is that when you hear things like microdosing, what you're talking about is an individual who's deriving tryptamine alkaloids from the mushrooms and is slowly feeding them to their brain so that they don't have the highs and the lows, because that's where you get depression. That's also where you get a lot of migraine headaches, which is what puts it in my wheelhouse, because I suffer from, or have suffered in the past from, regular migraines, but now introducing things like, I'm not a regular microdoser, but somewhat, as well as consuming balanced products between CBD and THC. And so you're hearing about these particular issues, I think, in part because a lot of the stigma associated with some of these other items is starting to melt away. Cannabis used to be considered a demon weed, when in fact, as I told you, the real demon isn't weed or cannabis, it's the devil's dandruff, which is sugar. So get rid of the sugar. But psilocybin cubensis mushrooms are now being examined all throughout the United States as following in the path of cannabis. And how did it happen? Well, in '96, as I mentioned, the state of California just decided to legalize cannabis for medical purposes. Now, the feds didn't like that, and the feds were threatening to come in and start shutting them down. But that became very difficult, especially when other states like Colorado and Oregon got in the mix. And now I think Denver decriminalizing is leading the pack on this issue, and there's no reason not to. As a general proposition, there is becoming less stigma associated with ethnobotanicals. In that context of ethnobotanicals are things like psilocybin cubensis mushrooms and something else that Joe Rogan loves to talk about called dimethyltryptamine, which is DMT. That's a whole nother show. If you're not ready to handle a couple of grams of mushrooms, I'd probably suggest you leave the bigger, faster rides of DMT for the other folks. We'll talk about that some other time. You can usually find psilocybin cubensis mushrooms growing wildly, but I wouldn't recommend eating wild ones unless you know exactly what you're doing, because it's kind of poisonous if you pick up the wrong ones. So it's cool if it's great, but if it's wrong, you got a big problem. Probably wouldn't kill you, but you'd be very ill. So you're unfortunately the only place that you can buy psilocybin cubensis mushrooms, if you don't grow your own, is illegally on the black market. So that's the unfortunate thing about this. But I think as those of us who have been involved in the cannabis community for these last several years, I see that you're going to see magic mushrooms come right behind it. And people are having more of an open conversation about it. I just spoke the other day with a friend of mine who's very, very ill, who is facing his own mortality. And I think he believes that this might be a way for him to start accepting his fate moving forward. There's a lot of fantastic stuff online to read about that. And I think I'm going to end here by asking you, if you have a personal experience with psilocybin cubensis mushrooms, good or bad, I'd like to hear about it. I want you to email me at ted@newsmunchies.com or go to our website, www.newsmunchies.com, so we can continue to have these conversations. But I'm hopeful that as we move forward, we're going to see less stigma, fewer people in jail over mushrooms, and maybe a few less migraines in the world. We look forward to hearing from you. You've got Ted Corliss at News Munchies. Be well.